A very good evening, Mr. K Shanmugam, Minister for Home Affairs and Law, Republic of Singapore, Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore and Ambassador at Large, Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Gavin Che, Consul General for Singapore in Mumbai, and Mr. R. Dinesh, Managing Director, TVS Logistics Services Limited and Chairman, CII Institute of Logistics, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, or ISAS for short, at the National University of Singapore and the Confederation of Indian Industry, CII, and Ananta Espen Center, India, we warmly welcome you to today's Singapore Symposium titled India's Engagement with a Fast-Growing ASEAN. The Singapore Symposium is a signature event of ISAS, organized in the South Asian countries. Today's edition of the Singapore Symposium marks the 10th in the series and 8th to be organized in India. To start the proceedings, it's my pleasure now to invite Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman of ISAS and Ambassador at Large on stage to deliver the opening remarks. Ambassador, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Shanmugam, Minister for Home Affairs and Law, Singapore. Mr. Che, who is our Consul General. Mr. Dinesh, who is the moderator for today. Ladies and gentlemen, let me first start by thanking our distinguished participants. First, Mr. Shanmugam. I think we have done, as Sitara mentioned, 10 programs so far. I think this is the third one he's probably doing. The other two were one in Chennai and, if I'm not mistaken, one in Sri Lanka. So he is the first time he's doing one in this part of India. And I'm looking forward to what he has to say on a subject which is very relevant. Then Mr. Dinesh, it's very kind of him to agree to be the moderator. He's a very busy person, and he gave us enough time. There's a third person I just wanted to mention, and that is Mr. Shyamal Gupta. He's the person who introduced Tata Consultancy to Singapore. I remember the first meeting, he arranged for me to meet Mr. Kohli, who was then administering TCS. And TCS went from strength to strength based on their first operation in Singapore. And even when they went into China, substantial part of that work was done out of Singapore. So this is Mr. Shyamal Gupta, who was at that time head of Tata Precision, one of the so-called high-tech companies in Singapore. Ladies and gentlemen, let me thank them and hope they will be participating very, very robustly in this meeting. We are short of time, so what we have decided is to lengthen speeches a little bit and ask more, give more opportunities for exchange of views. The topic for this evening's program is India's engagement with fast-growing ASEAN. The topic is crucial in importance to those in Singapore and Southeast Asia, as well as the Indian policymakers, businesses, and academic fraternity. The India of Southeast Asia India's and Southeast Asia relationship has proven to be inherently dynamic and what you might call somewhat changeable as well. Our India-Southeast Asia, a relationship that actually started some in 300 BC, if you go back in history, Southeast Asia, almost every kingdom at that time paid homage to China. But culturally, they were all Indian, in that Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on had taken deep root in this. The Chinese had no problem with that. The Chinese agreed, allowed that to grow, while they were considered the superpower of the area. So the relationship between Singapore, between India and Southeast Asia is a long-drawn one. Three aspects of this relationship stand out. First, ASEAN occupies approximately 10.6% of India's overall trade. And India's export to ASEAN stands at 11.26%. ASEAN is a beneficiary of India's onward improvement, growth, as well as it has gone into new areas such as pharmaceuticals, IT, telecom, and so on. Second, India's services in trade has really blossomed, and this again is one area of growth. The third is Indian diaspora in ASEAN has grown significantly, and Indian companies, there are some 2,000 Indian companies all over Southeast Asia. In the fight of the current fight between US-China or the trade war, ASEAN and India offer each other an affirmative definition of poor, where it's not poor, but definition of a moving situation, you know. In other words, doesn't seem to have a finality in it, or there doesn't seem to have reached a situation where one sees something that is not going to be turned into something that is favorable. And I think this may be some question that may be asked later. On the part of Singapore, we have worked closely with India to strengthen its linkages with ASEAN, and we'll continue to do so in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let me pass this mic to the MC to call on the first speaker or the guest speaker to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor now to invite our distinguished guest speaker, Singapore's Minister for Home Affairs and Law, Mr. K Shanmugam, to deliver his address. Minister, please.
Should have it ready. Thank you. Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Shri Dinesh, ladies and gentlemen. This series provides opportunities for ministers from Singapore to speak candidly with you, with our friends in India. I intend to keep my speech to hopefully 10-15 minutes, because the real point of these discussions is for you to ask questions and for us to exchange viewpoints. The topic is a safe one, but Dinesh, who is moderating, discussed with me and wants to take me all over the world. India, China, ASEAN, Hong Kong, race relationships, home affairs, a variety of topics which are unrelated. But I said, okay, we can deal with these questions. I think he also mentioned US, China. So we'll settle the problems of the world today. Before we get into the main issues, I want to point out some trends that connect us, which are interesting to note, and some similar points about India and ASEAN. And then I'll end off with maybe asking some questions myself. Our own connection, Singapore's connections with India go right back to the beginnings of modern Singapore. This year we are commemorating our bicentennial, 200 years. What bicentennial, you might ask? 200 years since a certain Englishman, Sir Stamford Raffles, landed in Singapore. When I was a schoolboy, we were taught that Raffles founded Singapore. And before that, of course, it was an absolute blank as far as the history books are concerned. So he, quote unquote, founded Singapore. And being Singaporean, we generally believe what we read. But of course, Singapore was not founded by Raffles. It's truer to say Tiffin was founded by the British, but not Singapore. Singapore, in its previous avatar, had been around from the 13th century, at least as a trading post, for over 600 years, and a busy trading post at the tip of the Malay Peninsula. It had trading and cultural links with various empires in Southeast Asia and further. And Raffles himself took his trip to look for a potential trading post in the southern tip to control the Straits of Malacca with the permission of the Governor General from Calcutta. And Singapore was administered from Calcutta. The links with India were multifaceted, led to substantial Indian immigration into British Malaya, which included Singapore. So the other politically inconvenient question is, why are we celebrating the fact that he landed 200 years ago? The reality is, while we were a trading post and relatively successful, Singapore becoming a British colony made a decisive change in Singapore's trajectory. Modern Singapore could not have taken its current form without the British, so we commemorate our history of colonialism. The positives far outweigh the negatives. It's quite different from your history or the history of many other countries. I mean, to take it in a very personal way, I wouldn't have been born in Singapore, but for the British. The school that I studied carried Raffles' name, and I studied law, which is English common law, which paid a good part of my income before I went into politics. Our political system is based on the British. So in many ways, our history and our feelings towards the British are slightly different, if I can put it that way, compared with many other countries. India played a key role in the modern history of Singapore, right from 200 years. And when we became independent, India was one of the first countries to recognize our independence. Now let me touch briefly on India and ASEAN. In 2018, we celebrated 25 years of ASEAN-India relations, but the ties go back more than 2,000 years. You heard a little bit from Ambassador Gopi. History, culture, language, all influenced these linkages. Some examples, if you take the state of Kedah in Malaysia today, it used to be called Kedaram in Tamil scriptures. It was mentioned in the Tamil poem Pattinapalai at the end of 2nd century AD. In the 11th century, the Chola king, I think it was Rajendra Chola, his fleets were said to have, quote unquote, visited Kedaram. I think it's a polite term. In Tamil scripts, it's said or spoken of as a conquest. Artifacts from South India dating back to the 11th century have been found there, indicating maritime links with South Indian Tamil kingdoms, and more than 50 ancient temples, known as Chandi, have also been found in Kedah. If you look at Cambodia, I think the majestic Angkor Wat temple, basically dedicated, various shrines are dedicated to Vishnu. The Khmer Empire itself is a Hindu-Buddhist empire, but you look at the names of the kings, Jayavarman, Indravarman, Harshavarman, Rajendravarman, Suryavarman. I think the influences were deep. And Indonesia, if you take Borobudur and Prambanan temple complexes, reflect the very strong Hindu-Buddhist influences from India, and our own name, Singapore, Singa singer you all know, and Pur. I was trying to work out the number of towns in India ending with Pur. And Ramayana characters deeply embedded into the cultural consciousness of many ASEAN nations, Thailand, Cambodia, Malaysia, Indonesia. Up to today, the coronation of the kings in Thailand done by a Brahmin priest. So when India became an ASEAN sectoral dialogue partner in 1992, it was really a continuation of a long-standing relationship. Within a decade, India became a full dialogue partner, then a strategic partner in 2012 at the ASEAN-India Summit in Phnom Penh. In 1993, in the early years of the partnership, the volume of trade between India and ASEAN was minuscule, just under $3 billion. It grew, however, at double digits, and 2002, 9 years later, was at 12 billion. By last year, it was just a shade under 80 billion US dollars. It's significant. India has become ASEAN's 6th largest trading partner, 7th largest source of foreign investment. The Prime Minister's Act East policy and the 3C, commerce, connectivity, culture formula for engagement with ASEAN, I think has also given a very strong boost. However, let's not get carried away with romanticism or treat history as destiny. History is rewritten each day with new relationships. So while the history of the linkages and the cultural linkages are extremely strong, the reality is that history is now being overwritten by the current realities and current economic linkages. What do I mean? The volume of trade between ASEAN and China, Japan, and South Korea are all more than double the India-ASEAN trade. And of course, China has also been making a strong push with BRI. The Southeast Asian region is one of great potential. Since 2000, the region has grown by an annual average of 5.4%, above the global average of 3.8%. It's got a combined GDP of just under $3 trillion and a collective market of 640 million consumers. Like India, ASEAN has a young population, a growing middle class, experiencing rapid urbanization. 60% of ASEAN's population is below 35, and by 2030, we expect that the middle class in ASEAN will double to 163 million. So the potential for growth is huge. And if you look at the linkage, India, of course, during the PM's first term, India overtook China as the world's fastest growing major economy. This year, the growth has slowed down a bit, but the reality is that the potential is much higher, and the secular trend, despite the blips up and down, is upwards. And many factors are in India's favor. The present geopolitical uncertainty provides an opportunity for India and ASEAN to really embark on greater economic cooperation. We represent a combined population of 1.8 billion, which is 25% of the world, and a combined GDP, which is just a shade under $5 trillion. During the Indian Prime Minister's keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore last year, he gave much cause for optimism. He signaled India's intent to deepen its regional engagements, enhance trade, fuel growth. The ASEAN-India FTA in 2009, 10 years ago, provided significant opportunities for our people and businesses. We hope to see greater land, air, maritime connectivity between India and ASEAN. The old sea routes that facilitated the flow of India's influence into Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, I think today you look at them as, you look at the accessible modern day transport that would serve to support the flows of people and goods between India and ASEAN. I mean, between Singapore and India, we have 400 flights a week now. Last night on my flight, it was chock-a-block. And India can leverage its comparative advantage in its tech sector, embrace digital opportunities in fintech. Singapore and India have begun exploratory steps towards greater digital connectivity, establishment of fintech joint working group between the India Department of Economic Affairs and our central bank. They can be extended to the rest of ASEAN. So while there are some reasons to have some concern about the international economic environment, I hope I have also given you some reasons to look ahead with some cautious optimism. Just as we have done in the past centuries, I'm confident that if we work to deepen our linkages, we can bring about a better and brighter future for our people. Now, let me end by leaving you with some questions. In this current environment, to what extent you think India will engage ASEAN economically, strategically, and politically? Second, how will this be influenced by India's interactions with other big powers? And third, what is India's own trajectory on the political, social, and economic fronts likely to be, and how will it impact on its relationship with ASEAN? I think these are questions that are worth thinking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. I would now like to invite Mr. R. Dinesh, Managing Director, TVS Logistics Services Limited, and Chairman of CI Institute of Logistics. He has already joined the Minister, and over to you, please. Yeah.
Good evening, sir, and let me add my warm welcome to you for making it here, both from CII, the Ananta Center, and ISAS. As far as I think CII is concerned, over the last 25 years, I think we have now been working very closely with Singapore, and you will be happy to know that more than a few hundred companies, of course, but large corporations have made significant investments in Singapore, including from Tata and our group and others in India, Godrej and others.
Including yours.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And if I can say so, equally interesting is that I think you had mentioned when we met you last time about people-to-people interaction and making sure we start involving the student community together. I think 5 companies from India, again including our group, have actually signed partnership with the top 3 universities in Singapore. And of the 10 of them whom we have selected, 3 are already in India. And I think the first, if I can say so, student interaction to internship interaction with business is starting to take place with Singapore. So it was your idea, so I thought I should highlight that we have acted upon it. Then straight away getting into the questions, and if I can say so, putting you on the spot, can I start by asking you, in terms of how do you see the India-ASEAN relationship progressing? I know there have been various discussions on RCEP and others, as well as how do you see the India-China equation, if I can use that word? And I think you promised to be open and honest, therefore I would request this question to be the first question.
India-ASEAN, India-China. India-ASEAN, the equation is simple. I think there is tremendous logic in the relationship. There is tremendous goodwill towards India in ASEAN, the cultural and historical linkages. But history is rewritten every day, as I implied in my speech. And the history of the last 200 years, the Spanish have left their imprint, the French have left their imprint, the British substantial influence, and post-Second World War, the Americans have been a dominant influence in Southeast Asia. And you know, the reality, as Mumbai will know more than most places, money is the biggest influencer. So, you know, the person with the capital, the person who brings the investment, the person who does the business gets the most influence. That's the reality, right? We generally, by and large, people are not into abstinence and giving up on the world. So, in that context, I think India's interactions have increased very substantially, I would say exponentially, but they are still, there is a gap between India's current role in economic terms, in strategic terms, compared with that of a number of East Asian countries. I mentioned China, South Korea, and Japan. And I see that as an opportunity which can be uh, tapped into. It leaves because the ASEAN population is also conscious, is price conscious. And India, one of the things India does well in the areas that it does go into is that it produces goods for a price conscious market. So there are a number of areas where India can, I think, do better. And if that is done, I can see that the interactions would be very, very fruitful. What is the competitive space? Let's be frank. Japan is so far ahead in terms of the industries it is in. China brings in a lot of capital. South Korea is also in the consumer goods sector, has a very significant lead. So one has got to see which areas Indian companies have an advantage. No point going head on in some of these areas. So that's, I would say, one perspective. India, China, it's a big thing, big question. China today, I think, sees itself as dealing with the US on equal terms. It doesn't see, I think, quite dealing with any other country on equal terms, and including India. Because the economy, they're at $13 trillion, and that's quite way ahead of the next largest economy, which is Japan, at 5 trillion maybe. So they're more than double Japanese GDP. They are four plus times your GDP. And their interactions today, both militarily and economically and worldwide, they see themselves as equal with the US. And just like India, I think they have a lot of respect for India. But just like India, we are talking about an ancient civilization, a civilization that has seen ups and downs and is secure within its own skin. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew used to say that the Japanese want to be like the Americans. And then he would give various others, people want to be like the British, people want to be like the Western Europeans and so on. But the Chinese don't want to be like anybody else. They're quite happy being Chinese. And they're quite comfortable being Chinese, and they're quite proud being Chinese, as I think many Indians are. There's a sense of optimism, a sense of great high culture, and that doesn't mean that both of these countries have got nothing to learn from anyone else. I think there's a lot that still can be tapped into elsewhere. But both are countries with a great deal of confidence in themselves. But China today looks at US. In fact, I thought somebody might ask me about China. Let me show you this poem. In this trade dispute that they are having with the US, there are negotiations that go on in Washington, and there are negotiations that go on in Beijing. So in a Beijing meeting, I saw an analysis which I'll share with you. Can we put it up? Now, this is the meeting in Shanghai. It took place on the 31st of July. On the one side of the US, on the other side, Chinese delegation. Look carefully at the characters behind, okay? Now, for a Western trained mind, you won't go and look at that because that's part of the wall decoration. But if you are a Chinese trained mind, you would. So let me tell you what it means. The first column, this is an old poem. First column, mountain is more beautiful when the cloud comes. The second column, the mountain remains a picture when the cloud is gone. The third column, mountain shines or darkens because of the cloud. The fourth column, the mountain and the cloud contrast each other in height. The clouds are higher, but the mountain reaches the same height. Fifth column, you may rely on a crutch to withstand the cloud and the headwind. Sixth column, when you turn back, the mountain is still there, the cloud has moved on. The cloud is the US, the mountain is China. You see, it's very subtle. It is there. This is how they see themselves. And it takes a peculiarly Chinese way of thinking to put up this poem. I'm told that the poem is much more beautiful. This is, translation in. Yes, sure. There you are. Those of you who read Mandarin can go and check this. So what is the message? You are a cloud, you are transient, you come here. I have been here for thousands of years and I'll be here for thousands of years. You just move on. So do you think there's going to be a trade deal on the American terms? It's a more powerful message than anything else, right? It's a very Asian way of looking at this. If you want the full article, go look up The Edge, which is a publication in Malaysia and Singapore. That's where I came across this article. It's not from any Ministry of Foreign Affairs assessment. But I found it very interesting because it gives you a preview of, a real insight into the Chinese way of thinking. So you ask me China, India, I think they will also give you poems like this. Yeah. And I'm sure you have poems too. Exactly. Yeah. From Artha Shastra and everywhere else. So that's my answer.
Thank you, sir. I mean, that is wonderful, if I can say that. But I was going to ask you about US-China, but I think you already covered that. But I wanted to ask you a question in terms of, obviously with all these trade issues, the geopolitical issues, I think Singapore in a way is in the center of it, or in the midst of it. I think the whole economy is built on global trade. In that context, how are you, or how is Singapore looking at working both as a country and also working with, if I can say so, the Singapore private sector? And how do you see India learning or India using what you may be looking at in terms of weathering these storms?
I think different. I get very nervous when anybody from anywhere else says, how can we learn from Singapore? Because, when I read your newspapers, I wonder why anybody will want to be a politician in this country. The number of problems that one has got to face. We are not talking about national newspaper, we are talking about Mumbai newspapers. And, if I had to face this, I'll run away. So, you're talking about a city with 3 million people, 30 lakhs citizens, 32 lakh citizens, and another 20 lakh of visitors. So, 50 lakhs. It's not quite. I'm not sure that we have lessons for anyone. The way Singapore is run, most of you, many of you would have either visited Singapore or would have heard about it. It's run in many ways from the top, like how you would run a reasonably successful company with economic logic and rationality, and political logic and rationality, and then being able to sell that economic and political logic to the people, because every 4 to 5 years you've got to get elected. Now, it doesn't quite work like that in most places, because whether it is politically doable and a number of different political imperatives and factions and arguments, I think, prevent, it's nobody's fault. It's nobody's fault. You can't blame, it's just size and different histories and so on. Any country in the world which runs a democratic system faces those issues. We face it a little bit less. But having said that, on this issue of trade, economics, private sector, what we are doing, we are peculiarly vulnerable, unlike you. For us, our external trade is 3 to 4 times the size of our internal GDP. Our GDP is about $320 billion, $330 billion. Our external trade is at about 1.3 trillion. We are the 14th largest trader in the world. So we've been successful, but it also means that every externality has a 4-fold impact on the internal economy, potentially. So it's very serious for us. And the slowdown, a lot of things that are manufactured or done in Singapore ultimately find their way into a supply chain into China and from China to the US. So the problems there impact us. growth is flattened out. It's going to be choppy, and I don't think that we are going to see a solution anytime soon on the US-China situation, because it's not just economic, it is also strategic. A number of issues. We can explore it later if you want. So there are reasons to be very concerned from a Singapore perspective, and also for many parts of the world. At the same time, from a peculiarly Singapore perspective, let me give you an unrelated example to illustrate my point. The Prime Minister speaks to the nation on a National Day rally, which he did on the 18th of August. Our independence is on the 9th of August. He talked about climate change, and he said, in the next 100 years, these are the things that could happen. And therefore, we have decided we are going to do this, and over a 100-year period. And we are going to set aside $100 billion for that. First of all, he says that as if it is, he's writing a check for $10,000. And second, he says it, nobody blinks. Everybody thinks, yes, okay, the Prime Minister says it'll be done. And nobody knows where is the money going to come from. And nobody doubts that it'll be done. And we are talking about a 100-year plan. Okay, it is doable in Singapore. Likewise, for this economic issue, people are a little bit concerned, but you go around, take a survey, everybody says, well, the government will take care of it, which is part of our strength and part of our problem, because the government then has got to take care of it. But we have a healthy financial position, both in terms of the annual budget and in terms of our reserves. So if necessary, we will take steps. We have internal economy that is being geared up technologically over time to be somewhat robust. We have ASEAN. So we are sort of watching warily, but we think that if we need to move in, we will be able to move in, and we'll be able to deal with externalities for a period of time. So that's the way we look at it. But when big countries argue with each other, it's usually small countries which suffer.
Thank you, sir. I think maybe one takeaway I will have is that maybe we also end up blaming the government, but for different reasons. So I guess it's our supporting our working on the government. I'll go with my last question and then throw open to the floor for asking questions. I think you have made waves when you took on Facebook. And I think many of us would have actually, read and also gone through what you did. But in the context of what happened then, and how do you see data protection, data security, and in a way the relationship between countries and how the future will evolve on this issue?
I would say there are a number of different issues here. The one issue which was the context in which I had my gentle discussion with Facebook was the issue of Facebook, the tech platforms. They are avenues through which information passes, but they have now become avenues through which societies can be seriously undermined, both from external people who want to do bad things and from sections within the community which want to turn the community against each other. So platforms and social media are great for communications, for connecting people, for making a better world, but there are not only good actors out there, there are lots of bad actors too. So how do we keep the good and keep in check the bad is the real issue. How do we make sure that those who want to do bad things are checked from using the internet for those things? Or in your context, all those rumors that circulate about child kidnappings and of one race or another race, and it leads to lynchings, and people die as a result of this. There can be riots because of this. Serious issues that come about. And the tech platforms are sometimes indifferent to these issues because, they are not there to do governance. It's a duty of governments to do governance. And we have to deal with it. And that was the context in which I was discussing it. And we have passed legislation on that. The first of 3 pieces of legislation. The second piece of legislation will be dealt with in Parliament in next month. And the third one would be in 2 months. The first one is on fake news or falsehoods on the internet. The second one would deal with race and religion and what you say and what you don't say about race and religion on the internet. And the third one would be foreign interference in domestic and internal politics through the internet. So these are the 3 major areas that we want to try and cover. The tech platforms are not completely happy with us, but we have a duty to the people in Singapore. And so that's one area. The second area that you raised is data privacy. Most of us sign up, or we sign up on Facebook. In principle, we have signed up to giving away all data without even knowing about it. I think the European Union takes a fairly stiff view about it and says we need greater transparency from the companies. We ourselves have put in some legislation. We are re-looking at this also for greater transparency. So are many others. I think it's the right way to go. Consumer needs to know quite clearly what he is signing up to before he signs up. No point referring him to some one-liner which then will bring him to some site which has got 20 pages of verbiage where he signs off everything. So it needs to be a little bit clearer, I think. Yeah.
And sorry, sir, the second part of the countries, how do you see the relationship?
Between countries, I think between countries, I don't see this as altering. I see this as another means for countries to continue with their relationship, either positively or negatively. These are tools. Countries will use them both for offensive and defensive reasons. They will use them like a tool. I mean, America uses it, China uses it, everybody else uses it. I'm sure India has built up capabilities, both offensive and defensive. And these are tools. You will use every tool possible to go and attack and defend. I mean, one can't be, a virgin about these things. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Now I think I'll throw the floor open to questions from the audience for you to answer, please. Yeah.
So I'm Kannan from Hinduja Group. I would like to know this Brexit and Hong Kong. Will it have some favorable impact on Singapore?
Brexit, I can't see what favorable impact it can have either on Singapore or most other countries. It's today the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world, the UK. And if it hurtles out of the European Union, with the kind of external linkages and trade relationships it has, and the kind of investments people from Singapore, India, undoubtedly other countries have made into the UK, thinking of the UK as a center for a much larger market. And if it gets out of European Union without a deal, the cost of doing that business in UK for all of us and our companies is going to increase. It's going to make it unprofitable. The question is the extent to which the UK government is aware of it. I'm sure it is aware of it. The outgoing chancellor has talked about it quite a lot. It's got a deep impact. But the assessment for us to make is the level to which the business cost is going to factor in calculations, and the extent to which the politics becomes more important than any potential business costs. Not potential, certain business costs. So I think it's generally a no-deal Brexit is most people, maybe it could be wrong, but most people assume that's not good for the UK, nor is it good for most of us, and that it can have deep issues. But we do seem to be, the odds on a no-deal Brexit seem to be increasing by the day. The commentaries, if you believe the commentaries, are, some of the calculations are that you don't have a deal on Brexit, but you project nationalism. You know, ultimately it's a democracy. It depends on what the people want, and if you believe that that's what the people want, you go for that. No deal Brexit. There's a sharp impact on businesses, but you go for elections after that, and you know, you politically you get your position validated by the people. So that's Brexit. Hong Kong, I mean, how much do you want me to answer? I don't see it as being specifically positive for Singapore in the longer term. I can see some short-term movements, particularly with money that is easy to flow. But in the longer term, how do places like Singapore do well? If India does well, if ASEAN does well, if China does well, if Hong Kong does well, there is plenty of business. I mean, just look at the sizes of the economies. India is a shade under 3 trillion. ASEAN is a shade under 3 trillion. China is at about 13 trillion. And Japan is at about 4 or 5 trillion. Australia is at about 2 trillion. You combine this, we are talking about huge economies. And Singapore is, in a way, well placed. Rule of law, easy to get in and out logistically, high connectivity, stable, logical, clear, transparent rules for both business. And if you put your money there, it is safe. If you get in there, it is safe. So for a variety of reasons, Singapore is an attractive place. And whereas if Hong Kong is not stable, and if that impacts on China, or even otherwise, instability, it creates ripples which are not very good from our perspective. From a Hong Kong perspective, I'm on record, I'm one of the few people who have commented publicly, but I'm on record as making the following points. One, you know, in this situation, you've got to find a compromise. Because if this carries on like this, it's not good for Hong Kong, it's not good for anyone else. However, if you look at what the terms of the compromise can be, insofar as it's economic, young people feeling that they have no stake in the system, they need a better life. 300 square feet in Hong Kong, 350 square feet in Hong Kong can cost you US $1.2 million. I don't think even Bombay costs that much, right? So, Mumbai, sorry. That, I think, can be solved by a public housing program because Hong Kong is the land. But some of the protesters seem very ideological. They want things from an ideological perspective. Now, that is not going to be easy to compromise on. And if the compromise involves challenging the rule of the Communist Party of China, then forget it. And Hong Kong has got to understand that it is part of China. It's not a separate sovereign territory. Nor can China allow that to be. I mean, if one of your cities or one of your territories agitated for separation, I'm not sure your government will look at it kindly either. So the international media has a very anti-China bias. And so the protesters are always democracy and freedom fighters. The police are always the bad guys. The protests are all unorganized, even though all of them turn up with face masks and gas masks and coordinated tactics. Even though there are enough reports of money being passed around, even though there are enough reports of foreign intervention. I'm not saying one or the other is right, but there is a uniform coverage in the international media that characterizes it in very black and white terms. I think India is not immune to such international coverage too on specific issues. So I think if you look at it like that, I think what is being asked for on ideological grounds is just not doable, and has the risks of coming to a very unattractive conclusion.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, at the outset, Mr. Minister, I would like to compliment you for a very comprehensive presentation that you made in the beginning. I'm Commodore Bhargav from Larsen & Toubro. It's an engineering company in the country.
I know Larsen & Toubro.
Yes. So my question relates to what we've been seeing, the Chinese compulsion for its energy security, which has led to
Chinese
compulsion for its energy security, which has led to creation of a strings of pearls between the Gulf and China, which passes through the Indian Ocean. And also of late, we've been seeing the Chinese nuclear submarine not only patrolling but also getting based. It has also been seen that some of the Chinese classical debt traps have led to the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka being virtually taken over by them. While India is looking at look east to act east, do we see that in this century of Asian century, as it is being called, a collaboration between ASEAN and India to have something similar to Asian-African corridor that Mr. Abe spoke about as a parallel of the BRI that Chinese have started? What are your views on that? We hear that the Asia-Pacific is now being called Indo-Pacific by the US, and they're also talking about Quad. So some emergence of these kind of initiatives are coming. Do we see an India-ASEAN similar initiative also coming up? Thank you.
Okay. There are a number of different questions there. One about the string of pearls, the other about BRI, and the third, the possibility of a Grand Indo-Pacific coalition, and the fourth, India-ASEAN, 4 different aspects. If I forget any of them, please remind me, but I'll try and run through them. The string of pearls, you know, if I can stand, it's easier. String of pearls is a, look at it from a perspective of a strategist. If you are sitting in Beijing, you know, I think we don't have the maps here, wanting, you know. Anyway, think of the map: Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Straits of Malacca. Now, if your oil supplies from Middle East go through the Straits of Malacca, which at its narrowest is no more than 8 kilometers or so, and all of it goes through there and then goes up to China, and you are sitting in Beijing, in the context of a conflict, you are thinking in terms of your energy security, you will be remiss if you don't think of alternatives. Because a single submarine in the Straits of Malacca can choke up the Straits of Malacca, and your oil supply is stuck. I mean, if India had all its ships going through a straits, which is right next to some other country, you will be thinking along the same lines too. So, if you look at China's interest today, one is energy security, the other is ranging from Latin America to Africa to Asia. If you look at it in terms of manufactured products, China looks at the whole world at its markets. And if we are trading with every country in the world, and they are importing food stuff from Brazil, they're exporting manufactured stuff to Latin America, you will look to do what the US did, which is to control both your supply routes and your trade routes. It's natural, right? And so you can see they are taking part in international operations. They've set up in Djibouti. And the string of pearls makes complete sense in that you have a series of ports which assure you security in terms of both your supply lines and your export lines, sea routes. Can those ports, Djibouti, Hambantota, and so on, be used for other purposes? You know, I don't know the answer, but India's concern and other people's concern is that these ports can be converted to other purposes, right? But this is international law. International law depends on who's got the muscle and who's got the money. And India wants to compete in that space. It's not going to be done through forums like this, right? China has built a port at Kyakpyo in Myanmar on the Indian Ocean. So it bypasses potentially the Straits of Malacca. It's of particular interest to us because just like the trade routes shifted from Venice and affected Venice, if the ships don't go through, I mean, this is my assistant has managed to get this, but Kyakpyo is there on the left, you see on the Myanmarese coast. China has built a big port in Kyakpyo and has built a railway all the way to Kunming so that its supplies can now go straight to Kyakpyo, don't need to go through the Straits of Malacca and can go straight to Kunming. And therefore, it will not choke China's supplies. Can China turn the table and choke other people? You know, I don't know. But they are building a big port on the west coast of Malaysia, in the Straits of Malacca too. Now, if that port gives a commanding overview of the Straits of Malacca, then that can assure them of perhaps security, but it also means that the US allies, South Korea and Japan, whose ships also pass through the Straits of Malacca, will now have to think very carefully. Right? But this is par for the course. It's not rocket science. And so that's the first part in terms of China's string of pearls. When you become an international economic power, when your supply lines stretch thousands of kilometers, when your export lines stretch thousands of kilometers, you will take steps to secure those lines. It's entirely logical and reasonable. The only question is whether you have will and the money to do it. They have the will and they have the money. And whether you characterize it as debt trap, I would say, to be a little bit more neutral about it, those countries took those loans. It's not as if, people didn't know what they were doing. And people were happy to borrow, and they became happier after they borrowed. And the taxpayers now have to repay the money or give suitable terms. For the countries in the West that are complaining bitterly about it, I think one just has got to look at the history of how they went and obtained various concessions around the world. I think there's a degree of hypocrisy involved when, I'm not saying India because India hasn't done this, but degree of hypocrisy when Western countries complain. I'm not talking about colonial times. Even in the last 20, 30 years, if you look at concessions in Libya on oil or concessions on oil in Myanmar and all that, you go and look at who the concessionaires are. Well, they say one thing at the UN about human rights. You look at who is making the money, who is getting, and why are various people taken out of power in various countries? So let's have a little bit of little less hypocrisy and a little bit more honest discussion, right? But from your perspective, from an Indian perspective, it's better to be realistic. Countries will do what they can. China will do everything that it can to assure itself, and economically, and back it up militarily. Right. Number one. Number two, the Indo-Pacific is, you don't need to go much beyond going back to China's own history and the period of the three kingdoms. You have different kingdoms fighting with each other. One becomes very powerful, others combine. So what you're seeing is essentially a reaction to a perception about China. Though everybody says this is inclusive, it's so inclusive that nobody has thought of inviting China to the club. It's inclusive except for China. And, these are big power games. We, Singapore, are too small to get involved in this. We stay out of it, but that doesn't mean we are stupid. We see what's happening, and we just try not to get sucked into any of this. But, India, Australia, Japan, sometimes it's trilateral, sometimes it's quadrilateral. It doesn't quite go into, I think, South China Sea. It's more into the Indian Ocean. It's something that Chinese must also be aware of, and I don't think China wants to start a major argument with all these countries. I think China's primary goal is still to improve China's own economic position and its own domestic position. Those are the primary sort of considerations for China. But it will do what it needs to protect itself. And I think China will equally be aware of its own history and not have all other countries combine against it. I think the Chinese will be aware of it. So it's going to require, it doesn't make any sense for countries today in the interconnected world to combine in an aggressive way against each other. It's in nobody's interest. And if we have any say in the matter, that's what we'll be telling the parties. It doesn't make any sense for parties to combine against each other. It's a mug's game. So coming to your point about India and ASEAN, how many naval ships do you think ASEAN has? Or carriers? Or air carriers? Nothing. Do you see ASEAN as an economic, as a military power? The 10 countries of ASEAN combining together as an economic power? We can't even agree on, police patrol. You think we'll be able to agree on defense cooperation? And defense cooperation, in effect, what you're suggesting with India against China, I think that will happen in the dreams, probably not even in the dreams. ASEAN will not take sides. And it's not in ASEAN's interest to take sides. Economically, ASEAN will be open because ASEAN, combined together, it's a big economy, big GDP, but that sovereign, each country is sovereign. Each country is just thinking in terms of, well, I want to be safe and I will do business with everybody. I'll do business with India, I'll do business with the US, I'll do business with China. That is the primary focus. I don't see it is in ASEAN's interest to get involved in a strategic entanglement with any big power. And if it does get into a strategic entanglement, the more likely would be, that if you look at the geographic proximity, China is the biggest dominant power in the region. That geographic fact, can that be displaced by a geopolitical fact? India is a geopolitical fact. Even the US is a geopolitical fact. So these are the realities of life.
Thank you, sir. That was really a very, very useful. Sorry, I think, madam, you had a question. I'll come back.
Can you use the mic? I can't hear you.
ASEAN may not want to get entangled, but it is entangled. There are lots of claims by ASEAN countries which conflict with the claims that China puts forth in the South China Sea.
But that's not an ASEAN issue. That's an issue between individual countries and China.
ASEAN has hoped that it can deal with China as ASEAN. After all, you've been having discussions for more than 10 years on a code of conduct in the South China Sea. How does that look to you moving forward?
Madam, you are from the foreign policy establishment. I've been a foreign minister. We both know the answer to that question. So let me nevertheless answer.
Go ahead.
Let me answer. First, ASEAN has been, and this is not just politically correct talk. I'm from Singapore. We don't have a claim in the South China Sea which conflicts with China. And therefore, we are very clear, this is not an ASEAN issue. Individual countries have to deal with it themselves with China. Now, number one. Number two, however, it is in all our interest to try and put that dispute into a box and try and deal with it in a way that doesn't create a problem for ASEAN as a whole, which is why we are working on the code of conduct. The first part of it 10 years ago was successful. The second part of it has taken time, and it has taken time concomitant with a China that is becoming much more powerful, and an ASEAN that is perhaps, countries of ASEAN which are perhaps more mindful today of their individual interests. And with some of whom who have got very strong economic relationships with either the US or China or other countries. And so each one will look at it, not unnaturally, from their individual perspectives. And I'm hopeful that we'll come to some kind of solution, but that's the best I can put it at. Yeah.
So I'm Rohit Mehta. I'm coming from Surat, and I'm the former president of the Southern Gujarat Chamber of Commerce and Industry in Surat. Well, so you have been talking about, it's a very heavy dose of intellectual inputs in international strategy. But let me come more on the ground and talk about the India's engagement with ASEAN countries on the economic front. So you mentioned...
I only answered the questions I was asked.
Yes, I understand. It's not your fault. But it was interesting. Let me be very clear about that also. So you mentioned about the 400 plus odd flights from Singapore to India. And Mr. Dinesh mentioned about the people-to-people interaction, which is important in the growth of economic relations. The growth story of India is happening in the two-tier cities. And we hardly find the connectivity from Singapore to the two-tier cities. How can you address this problem? Of course, I understand it is a government-to-government engagement. So can you take up this matter with the government from your side? And of course,
you think we haven't? You think we haven't?
But there's no result. We want results. As a two-tier city citizen, we want something to happen on this front so that a lot of engagement can happen and the trade can really go up with the ASEAN countries.
Well, I can tell you that we have taken it. Singapore Airlines is very keen to fly to a number of cities where it makes commercial sense to fly. The Indian government sometimes doesn't see it in the same light. I think sometimes Air India doesn't see it in the same light either. And so, if I may say so, you'll be better advised to discuss it with your government. Singapore... Well,
No, I think I can tell you this is something, it's not new. I think we have been representing this every time we go to Singapore and we get the same answer. So
it's true. I mean, even Madurai, there's a lot of flights from South India, and there is a tremendous need for flights from Madurai to Singapore. It's been asked for years and years and years and years. Recently, it has been approved in a very limited way. So, I mean, it doesn't mean that we are not approved to fly to tier 2 or tier 3 cities, but where the Indian side thinks that it makes sense for us to fly, the cities they give us doesn't tally with our own assessment of where it makes sense for us to fly. And those are discussions that one has. And as with many other things, these things take a bit of time.
please.
So I'm Praful Talera from Dynamic Logistics. I'm a product of the Port of Singapore, sir. So my
thank you.
question is, what if the Chinese manage to build the Kra Canal? How would it affect Singapore?
How will it
And what do you
affect?
see like the chances of it being built ever?
Well, for the last 50 years, people have been talking about the Kra Canal. And the suggestion is that if it's built, ships will bypass Singapore and they will go through the canal. Perhaps, from our perspective, the idea, Singapore itself is an idea. It's a city, but it's an idea. And it's an idea that the spirit of, collective spirit of a people can overcome any adversity. So you have 760 square kilometers. I told you just now, 32 lakhs of people. We are, without boasting, a brand name in many places. Right? The Singapore brand is known in many places. And I wouldn't be here and you wouldn't be here if Singapore is not successful. It's because Singapore is successful and well known around the world that you are here and I'm having this symposium. And that success and the collective will and the spirit cannot be upheld by being afraid of challenges and changes. If somebody builds the Kra Canal, we'll find some other way of surviving. The ports contribute 10, 11% of our GDP, not insignificant. But our GDP today, on a per capita basis, is at US $55,000. Number 2 in the world to Qatar. And Qatar is in a different category, right? 400,000 people with a lot of oil. Ours is built on our own sweat and tears, with a lot of reserves. And with a political system that requires the government to go to the people once every 4 or 5 years, regardless of what people talk about democracy in Singapore. So if they build a Kra Canal, we are not going to say no. We can't say no. We'll find other ways of surviving. In today's interconnected world, we have free trade agreements with a lot of countries. If you come to Singapore and you look at the startup scene, it's not India. We don't have your talent. We don't have your numbers. But the startup scene is vibrant. The logistics sector is vibrant. We are into animation and film. Some of the Hollywood stuff is being done out of Singapore. We train our young people to face the world in the IT side. Again, the talent is not comparable with India, but we make ourselves hospitable for talent in a way that bigger countries cannot. Right? Our value proposition is very different. We have just signed the Singapore Convention on Mediation. Every law student everywhere in the world who studies about dispute resolution will read the name Singapore and the Singapore Convention on Mediation. We have converted it into a multi-billion-dollar industry from nothing as a place to do dispute resolution, arbitration, litigation, and mediation. So Singapore, as long as it's well run, and as long as it has people who think not in terms of winning the next elections, but in terms of the next 30 years, 40 years, and what needs to be done, and then work backwards. The Accra Canal will be a challenge to be met. We have met bigger challenges.
Thank you, sir. Please.
Yeah. I mean, you know, before he asked the question, when we were cut out of Malaysian Federation, up to 1971, the ringgit, Malaysian ringgit and Singapore dollar were tied 1-to-1. Malaysia has palm oil, and my own calculation, back of the envelope calculation, is that if you look at the oil boom started, OPEC and so on, in the early 70s. Malaysia found oil in the late 70s. From the late 70s to through the 80s, 90s, 2000s, the oil flowed. Must have been at least 500 billion, maybe more, 600-700 billion. And then you had palm oil, you had rubber, all of that. So their currency is backed by all of that. What is ours backed by? Nothing. So they cut us off and they said, your currency is valueless. In 1980, it was 1-to-1. Today, it is 1-to-3. 3-point-something ringgit for the dollar. We don't have oil, we don't have palm oil, we have nothing, right? So, governance, integrity in public service, getting the best talent available, not the best talent, but the best talent available into public service, getting a government to be united with the people and thinking long term can do a lot.
Good evening, Mr. Shanmugam. My name is Rajiv Bhatia. I'm a student of business strategy as well as of the Northeast region of India. The question is very simple and it relates to the Northeast.
Whenever people say question is very simple, it's usually not very simple. But anyway, yeah.
Well, yeah, but it relates to the Northeast region. And I'd like you to share your views on the Northeast and what Singapore's engagements are with the Northeast and what your interests may be.
Northeast.
Northeast, Assam and the neighboring states. Thank you.
The Indian government has for some time suggested that ASEAN can better engage the Northeast region. And when I was foreign minister, I visited Assam myself. And we looked at some things that we could do. There is a lot of potential, particularly tourist potential. There is potential to train people there in the healthcare services and so on. And these are things that we talk about. I think connectivity is important. And one of the suggestions was for SIA to fly to Assam. I have to say, that's what I meant just now, somewhat politely, by what is suggested by the Indian side as to where SQ should fly is different from where SQ thinks that it has got the load factor to fly. So SQ didn't think Assam was a place that today it could fly and would have the necessary load factor. So those are assessments one has got to make. In order for the Northeast strategy to succeed, I think a fair bit of the heavy lifting has got to be done by the Indian side. The infrastructure, the connectivity, the tourist infrastructure, and equally important, I know it is safe, but the tourists must believe that it is safe. So headlines and media reports on terrorism and other attacks can impact on people's willingness to travel in the region. So there was some impact on that at the time when I was FM. I think the initiative to open up through the land route, through Myanmar, is a good one. I will say it is a good strategy. It is an interesting strategy. It requires considerable push on the Indian side to set up the infrastructure. I think the infrastructure is set up. I think there is a lot of potential.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I think we are almost come to the end of the program. Yeah. I had one final question which relates to...
You want to ask the audience whether anybody else has any last questions?
Okay.
Maybe can I see who has got questions? Two. Maybe we'll take both questions and then your
Okay,
question.
sir.
Yeah.
Yes, good evening, sir. A few years ago, there was a lot of talk, when ASEAN countries like Vietnam, Thailand, and Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore were becoming economic superpowers and, getting recognized on the in the global
That's
trade.
a rhetoric getting ahead of reality.
Yes, it is. But, we hear of their emergence all the time. And there was talk of ASEAN, having a currency of their own for regional trading purposes. So how viable would that be? And is that possible? Because I think that would reduce the dependence on the dollar. And if ASEAN becomes a trading bloc of its own, it would be a force to reckon with.
Okay. What would you need for the currency to be common between Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, and you would need a common monetary policy.
Yes.
You've
there was
been
talk
to,
about it.
You've been to Indonesia, you've been
I've
to Singapore.
Yes, I've lived in Singapore many years.
You've been to Thailand, you've been to Vietnam.
Right, I have.
Do you think at this stage of
They're
growth,
all at different stages of development.
is it going to be possible for us to have a common monetary policy?
There was,
Singapore runs a budget surplus every year.
Yes.
And we are very strict.
Right.
And regardless of political considerations, we do not loosen the purse
Europe
strings.
is the same, Germany, France, Spain, and all are different stages
I
of
know.
development, but they have come up with the euro.
Well, if you look at Europe, which is a comparison, first of all, they have a common culture, by and large. Based on Christian culture, they killed each other for several centuries and finally exhausted themselves and then decided that they needed to come together after Second World War. There was a very strong political impetus, but it's based on a common culture and a common set of values, and with Germany being prepared to underwrite other countries. That's a reality.
Singapore would take the lead in
You
this.
think we've got the money to underwrite the rest of ASEAN? Then your idea of Singapore. First of all, Singapore is not quite in that position. You forget that how small we are. Secondly, I think Singaporeans will be most unwilling to underwrite, given how small we are. We've got to be realistic, about these things.
Right.
There is no way Singapore's economy, which is 1/3 the size of Indonesian economy. Indonesia's economy is at $1 trillion. We are at about 300 odd billion. Thailand's economy is at about 500 billion. On a GDP per capita, we are big. And our economy is the same size as Malaysia's economy. They have got 175,000 square kilometers. They've got 30 million population. So it's a significant achievement for Singapore in terms of size to have an economy which is the same size. But that doesn't hide the reality that Thailand and Indonesia have much bigger economies. Vietnam is growing. One is a communist system. We have Christian countries. We have Buddhist countries. We have Muslim majority countries. I think the differences from Europe are quite obvious. And for us to come together and to try and agree on a common monetary policy which can be imposed with a degree of fiscal prudence across all the states. And it's not that we do things better or others do things worse. When you have 220 million population like Indonesia, and you have 19,000 islands, and the people are in very sort of different stages of development, your needs and imperatives are very different from that of a highly cosmopolitan, modern, urban city-state. It's difficult to run a common policy, I think. I think it can be an aspiration.
Yes.
Yeah, it'll take some time, I think. There was a gentleman with a question, maybe a final question.
Your Excellency, good evening to you.
Evening.
My question is that before start of India ASEAN, China ASEAN, you might have done some analysis before coming over here that China in engagement with respect to the on the axis of India China with Asian with fast growing Asian. So what do you give the take to the Indian entrepreneurs or the Indian industry? What are the mistakes the Indian industry is making due to which the difference in the investment or the difference in this is around threefold, India and China with respect to that.
Yeah. I don't think I would say Indian industry is making mistakes. I think essentially your question boils down to India and China and the differences. It's a question that's asked by many people at different fora. I have a slightly different take on that. It's not that one system is superior, one system, 1947, you chose a system. It's a unique experiment in the world that India is engaged in for the last 70 odd years, which is one man, one vote. From the time you became independent, when you were at a very low level of economic development, literacy, and social development. As far as I know, I'm not a student of political science, but as far as I know, no country has ever engaged in that experiment. The Americans say they are the fount of democracy. But the fount of democracy, first of all, when America started, denied the vote to women, denied the vote to everyone except a white male with land-owning property. So you had two parties, but it was a very small franchise. At a very restricted, and in the first 100-odd years, economic development took off and the infrastructure was laid and the American sort of, the basic sinews of American power were built. The franchise was actually relatively limited. And you had common policies regardless of who came to power. Yes, they had a big argument, otherwise known as a civil war, but nevertheless, broadly the policies were similar, right? If you take UK, the mother of parliaments, if you remove the rhetoric and you look at it, up to the late 19th century, what percentage of the population had the right to vote? Women couldn't vote, that's half the population. Quite a lot of other people couldn't vote. If I haven't gotten my numbers wrong, it may be no more than 30%, 30% of the population. So they all developed while at a time when the rights, suffrage was limited. Women only got the vote in the 1920s or so in the UK. So Singapore gave universal suffrage in 1965 before Americans had full universal suffrage. So you are engaged in a unique experiment where everyone could vote. And if you look at the Indian map, you have how many languages, how many people, races, and you have a federal and state system. If you have a solution, if you want a solution for a problem, if you and I sat down in a room, we probably can come to a solution in 45 minutes. But if you have to mediate between the different interest groups that are involved at the state level and then at the federal level, and that is on the assumption that everyone is working in good faith, which is the ideal of a democracy. You all sit there, you're not looking at it from a self-interest, you're looking at it from a common interest, different ideas, you argue, and then you get a lot of light. But you and I know democracy in every country, not just India, works on the basis of some degree of self-interest, right? To put it mildly. And so India has chosen a system, whether knowingly or unknowingly, that puts in a significant deficit on quick decision making. Right? If you are running a company, you will not be consulting your shareholders on every decision you make. nor would you be subjecting yourself to different viewpoints in the media on every decision. And you would just take your decisions and then subject yourself to the AGM once a year. So it's different. Here you're dealing with people's lives. This sort of decision making creates creates some impact on your full potential, but it also prevents you from going way off or going wrong. There's a certain ballast that is built in. If you look at other systems, there are systems where the decision making in China, first of all, is a single race. It's used to a unified system and central command. And when somebody presses the button in Beijing, in Hangzhou, the light flashes. Here, somebody presses a button in Delhi, you think the light flashes in Chennai? The wrong light will flash, right? If you are lucky, if a light flashes at all. But it is part of the design of the system, the state and center divide. And having chosen a different path, then there is no point comparing and saying, how come we are not on the same trajectory? It's a different path. You also didn't have the Cultural Revolution. You also didn't have the Great Leap Forward. You didn't have, the issues that China has had with central authority. Central authorities, centralized power can work brilliantly when the people at the top have the country's interests at heart and push forward. And in the last 30 years, 35 years, China has achieved a miracle that no country in the history of mankind has ever achieved. 500 to 600 million people have been lifted out of poverty in 35 years. I mean, from the time when they were on bicycles and dirt roads to today, missiles and rockets and going to the moon and high tech, but most importantly, in terms of basic health care, female empowerment, education, the way they live, made a significant difference to the lives of the people. But the system allowed it. Your system, as I was driving last night from the airport, I was looking at some of the tenements, which are sea-facing, very high-value land, but in somewhat in need of some repair. Sort of roof has fallen down, and people are sitting sort of stones all over, little sort of holes in the wall. These are highly valuable pieces of property. And I thought to myself, India has the brain power and the resources to send a rocket to the moon. But it's probably easier for India to send that rather than remove one of these tenements. Because before you can do that, you will have to go through a very elaborate process. Perhaps might involve the Supreme Court and may involve a number of years. So this is mediation between people. It's far more difficult than scientific brain power sending, rockets to the moon. It's not that you don't know or you don't have the solutions. It's just that the system, which was designed in a way that creates a certain requirement for argument, expressions, discussions, whatever you call it. And it takes time. So no point comparing with other systems. The question is whether even if you wanted, you can change the system. Yeah. So I don't think it's going to be easy. Right.
Thank you, sir.
You had a question.
No, I think
Okay.
that's fine, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister, for such an interesting and insightful sharing. And ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of today's Singapore Symposium. And on behalf of ISAS, we would like to thank CII and Ananta Aspen Center for co-organizing today's Singapore Symposium with ISAS. We would now like to invite you to a buffet dinner and to join us for future events. Once again, thank you so much. Thank you.